The new Kite meta for ZvZ in Albion Online is coming faster than anyone expected. But now, the race is on to figure out which substyle of Kite will be king on the battlefield. The Zergs that find the optimal Kite composition and tactics first will leap ahead of the rest. Now, maximizing Kite's potential is not something so simple as getting a comp sheet out and filling in the roles. You see, Kite style is significantly more complex than Brawl and requires in-depth analysis to understand why it works in the first place. With this in mind, we will begin with a simple explanation of what Kite is, and then move on to the higher level concepts and mechanics that Kite looks to exploit. On a general basis, Kite is simply a style of ZvZ in which a Zerg applies a sort of hit and run strategy against their opponent. Think of it like guerrilla warfare, where Kite Zergs attempt to deal damage to the enemy without ever getting fully committed to the fighting. The way this is achieved is mostly through a difference in speed. A Kite Zerg typically engages into an enemy's front line and then backs up once their damage is out. The goal is to get away from the enemy quickly so that by the time they counter-engage, they're either so far away that they can't hit you, or they only hit a few of your players instead of getting a big clump. It's exactly this hit and run tactic that has earned Kite a negative reputation, which makes it seen as the coward style. This is in direct contrast to Brawl, which is viewed as the brave and heroic way to fight because players expose themselves to close quarters combat. Regardless how you look at it, the truth is that Kite relies much more on skill and intelligence rather than strength and willpower. Brains over brawn, if you will. The reason is that Kite takes into account Albion's game mechanics and exploits them in such a way that allows for significantly smaller Zergs to defeat bigger ones with minimal losses. One of the mechanics that Kite exploits is resilience, or focus fire protection. I will be using both of these names interchangeably since they're exactly the same thing. Anyway, this mechanic reduces the damage a player takes based on how many enemies hit him within a 10-second rolling period and lasts 5 seconds after the last new player hit. With only 6 enemies hitting you, focus fire protection will reduce the damage you take by nearly 50%. Now, in a Brawl scenario, a player would be constantly buffed with this extra defensive, since players use every Q, W, and auto attack as much as possible to win the fight. However, with Kite, the focus fire protection buff becomes minimal, as engages between the Zergs only last a few seconds at most, which is not enough time to Q and auto attack more than just a couple enemies. Now remember that the resilience lookback period is 10 seconds and lasts 5 seconds afterwards, which means that the total removal of the resilience buff will take at least 5 seconds, but it restarts each time a new player hits you, so the actual protection can last much longer. Being that the Brawl style promotes low cooldown weapons and high cooldown reduction builds, it is very likely that resilience plays a major role throughout the entirety of Brawl fights. On the other hand, Kite incentivizes higher cooldown weapons due to the timing of hit and run tactics, which allows for the focus fire protection buff to expire fully before the next engage. A quick note before we go on to the next Kite exploit. The reason Kite and Ranged DPS go well together, other than timing and distance, is that because Kite denies the enemy their resilience buff, having resilience penetration on your weapon is not as important or nearly as valuable as it is with Brawl, where all players have high resilience buffs. Remember that resilience penetration is a stat based on percentage, so the lower the resilience buff it is applied on, the less effective it is on raw numbers. Another mechanic that Kite exploits is the AOE escalation mechanic. This is because, as mentioned before, the hit and run tactic's goal is to get away from the enemy as quickly as possible after an engage, so that even if the enemy does hit, they will only hit a few of your players. In essence, you are robbing the enemy of their AOE escalation buff by getting away from them. Not only does Kite take away the enemy's ability to use AOE escalation, but it still manages to keep the benefit for itself. The way it does this is that when a Kite Zerg turns around and engages, they don't usually have to run very far towards the enemy because the enemy is already running towards them. Not only that, but Kite usually runs ranged DPS, so the turnaround distance for Kite Zerg to hit the enemy Zerg is very small. This means that a Kite Zerg can pop boots towards the enemy, use their engage, and still have some time left on their boots to get far away from the enemy. In contrast, an enemy Zerg is going to have to use their entire sprint or their double blink to try to catch the enemy kiting Zerg. It is at this moment that Kite then takes advantage of AOE escalation for itself, as the enemy used their entire sprint to run forward, leaving no speed boost left to spread out before the next Kite engage. In essence, the enemy only managed to get a small clump with minimal AOE escalation, while the counter engage of Kite has potential to hit a larger clump. Although this all sounds like theory, it has been done countless times during the pre-season 14 Kite meta. Typically, however, this happens towards the end of a Kite ZvZ, as the main tactic of Kite is not to get big clumps, but rather to destroy all of the enemy tanks first. Farming enemy tanks is another one of Kite's exploits, as it looks to mitigate crowd control diminishing returns in order to isolate the front line. How it does this is by CCing the enemy at different times rather than dropping all crowd control at once. This allows for CC diminishing returns to drop off, ensuring that each stun, root, and slow last as long as possible. This then leads to the enemy Zerg being staggered by that crowd control because it is much more effective on leather and cloth than plate. Generally speaking, plate's crowd control reduction is about 10 to 15% more than cloth and leather, which means that as the Zerg kites, the enemy chasing gets strung out, leaving the cloth farthest behind, leather in the middle, and plate much closer to the front. Knowing that healers typically wear cloth, when the Kite Zerg turns around to hit the enemy front line, they will find mostly tanks there, and their healers will be too far behind to save them. This means that the longer the enemy chases the Kite Zerg, the fewer tanks they will have. At the point in which the enemy's front line is gone, the Kite Zerg can stop kiting, face the enemy, and engage directly into their back line without fear, as there will be no tanks left to stop them. The next one is not necessarily an exploit of Kite, but rather a very intelligent way to turn an enemy's advantage into a disadvantage. As we touched on earlier, Brawl Zergs tend to run weapons with low cooldowns and builds with high cooldown reduction. These Zergs lose a lot of utility to gain lower cooldowns, but they are effective nonetheless because they are able to take full advantage of their short cooldowns. An example of this would be using Assassin Hood instead of something like Adjudicator Helmet. The Assassin Hood would reduce all your cooldowns significantly, and if you can use the reloaded skills effectively as soon as they're ready, then you are optimizing your build. However, if you use your Assassin Hood to reset, let's say a 30-second cooldown, and I know it doesn't actually reset a full 30 seconds, but even if it did, resetting a 30-second cooldown with your Assassin Hood is worthless if you don't use that cooldown for 30 seconds because you could have just waited for it to reset on its own. Now, not using your cooldown for 30 seconds sounds like a lot, but this is exactly what Kite does. It doesn't provide many opportunities for enemies to engage them, and when it does provide these opportunities, it's usually about 25 to 30 seconds apart. In effect, Kite makes low cooldown builds pointless. Not only does this affect something like Assassin Hood though, but even weapons like One-Handed Hammer, because the Grove Keeper alternative provides mobility and resistance bonus that you lose out on for that lower cooldown. Yet against the Kite comp, the One-Handed Hammer won't be able to take full advantage of its lower cooldown. By taking the cooldown advantage away, Kite doesn't make the enemy fight on a level playing field. It completely removes the trade-off that low cooldowns get and only leaves the deficit, turning an enemy's advantage into a terrible disadvantage. Now, there are countless other advantages that Kite has, such as easier visibility of the enemy engages and time to stabilize your Zerg after engages. But none of this matters if the style is not done properly. Today, Kite Zergs are only taking advantage of some parts while completely ignoring others. For example, many Kite Zergs are running cooldown reduction builds wherein they engage, reset cooldowns, and re-engage. This runs the risk that your second engage will be mitigated heavily by resilience. Not only that, but clumping together for royal jackets and standing still for an assassin hood channel goes against the very idea of hitting and running. Now, I know that people will say, well, it works, and then point at some guilds who do this and win some fights. Well, of course it works, but it doesn't work because it's good. It works because the enemy is bad. You see, just like the Albion community has forgotten how to play Kite, we have also forgotten how to play against Kite. Most Zergs are not using the weapons that are needed to stop Kite in the first place. These weapons are Icicles, Grail Seekers, Grove Keepers, and others. And if they are using them, it is in very small numbers. Not only that, but many Zergs are still playing Brawl with Infernal Sights, which means that they don't just need to catch up to the Kite Zerg, they need to walk all the way into the Kite Zerg to be effective because they lack the range on their weapon. Another issue with the current iteration of Kite Zergs is the lack of peel and damage from Qs and Ws. Relying solely on tanks to stagger the enemy is not enough against an enemy who has the proper comp to catch Kite. So you need things like firewalls, robes of purity, and rings of fire from face scale robes. Although many healers use robe of purity, they're simply not enough, which means that the DPS players need to bring either face scale robes or robes of purity to supplement. Yet, as it is now, most DPS and Kite Zergs are still running leather. As for the lack of damage on Qs and Ws, it is critically important for a Kite Zerg to have adequate options to push enemy tanks out of their Zerg. For Kite style, the integrity of the Zerg is paramount to success. If enemy tanks are allowed to stay inside of a Kite Zerg without much punishment, the Kite Zerg will fall apart. Because of this, you need to force the enemy tanks to run back for heals by putting damage on them. What you don't want to do, and this is exactly what is happening with most Kite Zergs today, is to call a full engage on a single tank in your back line. It is a waste of a cooldown even if you do kill that lone tank, simply because you could have easily pushed him off with Qs and Ws, and then use that engage for a better time. Most Kite Zergs are running Rift Glaive, which would be decent-ish with the first Q and Forest of Spears, but they're using the second Q and second W to stack for the E most times. Aside from the Rift Glaives, Kite Zergs today are using War Gloves, and while Triple Kick is very good at kidnapping players, it takes the entire Zerg to clump on a single player to kill him with melee auto attacks because the Q does minimal damage. Because of these issues, I recommend to instead run Fire Staffs and Crossbows, because the first Q for both of them are extremely high in damage output against single targets. Not only that, but Fire Staffs also benefit from the Firewall W, and Crossbows can choose between Caltrops to help with slow or Sundershot to pierce those tanks in your back line. Whether you follow these last couple recommendations or not, doesn't matter. What matters is that whatever composition you end up making for Kite takes advantage of every single one of those exploits explained earlier. Maximizing Kite's potential is tough, but Kite Zergs are popping up on all 3 servers, and guilds are wasting no time experimenting how to get the most out of this style. Hopefully this video helps guide you towards Kite success, and if you have any questions or feel as though I'm wrong about how to optimize Kite, drop a comment below and we'll talk about it. Thank you for watching.